Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Am Yitz Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Kuf Pei Hey Amid Aleph. I'm going to try to finish Siman Shin Lamed Ches, but let's see. So, without further ado, our learning should be a schus for all those in Klal Yisrael who require schusim, which is all of us. Okay, says the Mechaber Sif Gimel, bottom line on Kuf Pei Dalet Amid Beis. Zug hamekashkesh l'shois, a clock that is made to chime on the hour. Also al yidei mishkalois, that operates by weights. So this would be an old-fashioned, let's say, grandfather clock. If you could visualize the standard picture of a grandfather clock in your mind, so you've got the clock on top, you've got the glass cabinet kind of on the bottom, and you've got weights. The way the clock worked was by those weights. Those weights are what energized the springs that drove the gears that drove the clock. So you have a zug hamekashkesh l'shois, you have a clock that chimes on the hours, also yal yidei mishkalois, and it operates by weights. Now, there used to be a timekeeper who would actually come around to houses to adjust the weights to make the clock work. In other words, when you arrange the weights the proper way, the clock will operate for X amount of time until the weights drop down all the way to the bottom, and then the clock has to be reset. The weights have to be reset in order to continue driving the clock. Are you allowed to arrange the weights? Are you allowed to make the clock operational before Shabbos and then allow it to operate on Shabbos so that it will chime on Shabbos? Says the Mechaber, Mutter la'archai v'lahachinai miba'od yom. You're allowed to arrange the weights and prepare the clock before Shabbos, miba'od yom, on Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos, kidei sheyelech v'yekashkesh kol Shabbos, so that it will be functional and it will chime on Shabbos. So what is the Mechaber telling me here? You have a clock that is going to chime. The Siman here, Shimon Lamed Ches, we've been talking about things that are osir, mishom hashmas koil. Now, by setting the clock into motion, by making the clock operational on Erev Shabbos, you're creating a situation where it's going to make noise on Shabbos. Is that a problem? Says the Mechaber, no, it's not a problem. Now, the truth is, we learned already a long time ago that to put a malacha into play on Erev Shabbos, to do something on Erev Shabbos so that melacha will happen on its own without your participation on Shabbos is mutter. So, yeah, you're not being mashmiya koil on Shabbos over here. The clock is being mashmiya koil. You're putting it into play on Erev Shabbos by making the clock functional on Erev Shabbos. That's not a problem. The bigger chiddush of the Mechaber over here is that there's another reason why you might see this as being problematic, and that is the issue of avshamilsa. We learned earlier that there are things that operate very loud that you're not allowed to put into play. You're not allowed to set them in motion on Erev Shabbos. Why? Because since they're very loud, when people hear the operation on Shabbos, they're going to be choshed you that you're doing malacha on Shabbos. Kamash Malon, the Mechaber over here, that you're allowed to make the clock operational on Erev Shabbos because nobody is going to think that you arranged the weights and you made the clock work on Shabbos. Now, to make the clock work on Shabbos is a problem. And the truth is, like the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us, there are two problems. There's one, Issa D'Rabbanan, which is the topic of Shimon Lamed Ches, the problem of Hashmas Koil. By making the clock operate on Shabbos, you're creating sound and you're using a Kli HaMiyuchad Lekach. The clock is intended to chime on the hour. So by making the clock operational on Shabbos, you're being mashmiya koil with the Kli HaMiyuchad Lekach, and that is it is a D'Rabbanan. But the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us there's also a very great potential for an Issa D'Oraisa. If the clock was not moving, if the clock wasn't operational, it had already stopped, and you go ahead and you reset the weights to make it go, that's mamish maka b'patish and tikkun moneh, anissa daraisa. The Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that there's even a shita that holds that if the clock is running on Shabbos, but you reset the weights so that it should continue running without stopping, there are those that hold that that's also tikkun moneh. So there's potential here not only for the Issa D'Rabbanan of Hashmoas Koil, but also an Issa D'Oraisa of Tikkun Moneh and Makeh B'Patish. So again, what the Mechaber is telling you is, you're allowed to set the clock going on Erev Shabbos, and you're allowed to allow it to run on Shabbos. There's no problem of Hashmoas Koil, because you're not being Mashmiya Koil on Shabbos. You're not doing anything on Shabbos. You did it on Erev Shabbos. There's also no problem of Marasayan. There's no problem of Avsha Milsa. There's no problem that when the clock makes noise on Shabbos, people are going to be chayshid you that you set it up on Shabbos, which would be an Issa D'Rabbanan and maybe even an Issa D'Oraisa. Okay, we're going to see all this now in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah back on Kuf Pei Daled Amud Beis, Eis Kat Yud Gimel, Zog HaMekashkesh L'Shais, a clock that makes noise on the hour. It's in a loymar. What the Mechaber is discussing here is a Moira Hashois, a clock, Shekaren Zeger, Sha'asei Lashmiya Koil, which is made to make noise, Lahidia Hashois, in order to make you aware of the hour. So this is a clock that chimes on the hour. Okay, Mr. Bryce cutting your dalit. And the Mechaber said, Mutter la'archai, you're allowed to arrange the weights on the clock. Hainu, we don't have to be concerned that when the clock makes noise, yachshadu, people are going to be chayshid you sheharichai b'Shabbos, that you set it in motion on Shabbos. Because it is very well known that people don't set their clocks every day. It was well known that this is something that has to be done every several days or whatever it is. So when somebody hears the clock chime on Shabbos, they don't say, oh my goodness, Ruvain set his clock in motion on Shabbos. No, they understand it was done from yesterday. You're allowed to prepare it before Shabbos. Avo bit Shabbos. But to set the clock up on Shabbos, we don't need to tell you that if the clock stopped, you're not allowed to reset the weights and make it go on Shabbos. Even by winding the spring, many paiskim hold that this is mamish is a daraisa to have b'chlal tikkun moneh. You're taking something which is not functional. You're taking a stopped clock. It's not functional. And you're winding it. You're resetting the weights. You're giving it energy. You're energizing it. And you're making it into a functional clock. That's Makeh B'Patish tikkun moneh. Ella. Even if the clock is still going, it's still aser. You're not allowed to reset the weights. But and even by a pocket watch, to pull something that resets the spring and makes the gears turn, so that it shouldn't stop. So the Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here on Shabbos. Forget it. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to do this. If the clock stopped, it's tikkun moneh. If the clock is still going, according to some, it's still tikkun moneh. If it's necessary to do it for a chayla, if a chayla needs to know the time, maybe a chayla needs to know when he has to take his medications. So if a chayla needs to know the time, so okay, if it's still going, it would be preferable to find an Eini Yehudi to do it, but if you can't find an Eini Yehudi to do it, will be matir to allow you to do it if the clock is still going. Because if the clock is still going, there are shittas that hold that this is only a D'Rabbanan, not a D'Oraisa. For a chayla, even a chayla she'ein by sakana, to ask an Eini Yehudi to stop to wind the clock, even if it stopped, is mutter, because even if it's in Issa D'Oraisa, you're allowed to do Amir La'akom and an Issa D'Oraisa for a chayla, even a chayla she'ein by sakana. Vedan, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah. Veda oid. Da'is and Myre Shois, those watches, Shekar Tashin Ur, pocket watches, Sharagal Pa'amim Kisha'imit, sometimes when they stop, V'nifsak Mehiluchai, and they don't go anymore. Hu Minanoi B'mixas, if you shake it, Chayzer Lehiluchai, it makes it start going again. Good old-fashioned watches that you had to wind that were spring-driven. Sometimes when they stopped, if you shook it a little bit, it would start going again for a little bit. You would not be allowed to shake it on Shabbos. So in a nutshell over here, Siv Gimel, what the Mechaber said is you're allowed to set up the clock and make the clock go on Erev Shabbos, even though it's going to make noise on Shabbos. There's no problem of Hashmas Koil, because you're not doing anything on Shabbos to be Mashmiya Koil. Whatever you're doing on Erev Shabbos. There's also no problem of Avsha Milsa. We don't need to be concerned that when people hear the clock chiming on Shabbos, they're going to be choshid that you wound the clock or reset the weights on Shabbos. Now, if you did it on Shabbos, it would be a very big problem. To do it on Shabbos, A, is in Issa D'Rabbanan Hashmas Koil, because now you are doing something to make noise on Shabbos, and the clock is a Kliya Meyuchad L'kach. Another problem is a potential for an Issa D'Oraisa of Tikkun Moneh and Makeh B'Patish. And on that, the Mishnah Berurah pointed out that there is a chiluk amongst the Paiskim. Some Paiskim hold that there's only an Issa D'Oraisa if the clock stopped. If the clock stopped, that it's no longer functional. When you reset the weights, you're making it functional. That's where you have Makeh B'Patish / Tikkun Moneh. Other Paiskim hold that there's even Tikkun Moneh and Makeh B'Patish if the clock didn't stop. Somehow, even if the clock didn't stop, when you reset the weights, they consider that to be a Tikkun Moneh. Now, on the question of Avsha Milsa, a question that comes up very often is the use of alarm clocks on Shabbos. So there's a famous tshuva from the Rishiva Zatzal, from Rav Moshe, Zechet Tzadik L'Vracha, who said that if you want to set an alarm clock before Shabbos and you want to allow it to ring on Shabbos, it depends how loud the alarm is. What the Rishiva writes in the Igris is that if the alarm could be heard outside of the room that it's in, Rav Moshe said you can't do it. Why? And this is critical, because Avsha Milsa, since the clock is going to make noise, people are going to hear the clock, they're going to be choshish that you set the clock on Shabbos. Now, the truth is, I don't think that that's negeya anymore. Nobody sets alarms, Kimat, day by day. You set your alarm, and your alarm remains set, unless you have to turn the alarm on again each day. So I'm not sure that this tshuva is still negeya, or maybe nowadays it's really nobody is choshed that you set the alarm today. You have to know the facts on the ground. I guess you have to know the facts on the ground. But there are definitely paiskim that hold that it is mutter to have alarms ringing on Shabbos. Just trying to think in my mind. You know, an alarm clock nowadays, a digital alarm clock, or people who use their phones for the alarm, you set up an alarm, a daily alarm for 7 a.m. The question is that after the alarm rings, you turn it off, and then you have to turn it back on again. So when somebody hears the alarm, they're going to be choshed that you turned it on today on Shabbos. I don't really hear the room for the chshad anymore. Okay. Moving along to Sif Daled, second line down, Kuf Pei Hey Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. Hamashame, and this is a halacha that we already alluded to earlier in this Siman. Hamashame Peroisav is somebody who's guarding his produce, Uzra'av, his plants, Mipnei Chayav Ha'oif. He's guarding them, he's protecting them from beasts and birds that may come to ravage the crop. Lo Yispait Kaf al Kaf, he's not allowed to clap to make noise, to scare away the animals. V'lo Yitpach Kapov al Yerechai, he can't smack his hands against his legs. V'lo Yeraked, he can't jump up and down and bang with his feet. Lavricham, in order to chase the animals away. Why can't you do this? It's not a problem of Hashmas Koil, because this is not Derech Shira V'Simcha, certainly not. So there's no Gzerah Shem Yisaki Kli Shir with anything that you're doing here. What's the problem? The problem is Gzerah Shem Yital Tzrar V'Yizraik Lahem. The concern is you might pick up a rock and you might throw a rock at the animal or at the birds. By doing that, you might be over on hoitzah. You might throw the rock out to Rishus Harabim. So that's the reason why this is asur. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton tezayin v'lo yiraked. You can't dance around beregel with your feet. La shmiya koil, in order to make loud noise. La havis ha'ifais, in order to scare away the birds. The gzeira is as cotton yudzayin v'yizrek lehem. We're afraid you might pick up a rock and throw it at them l'Rishus Harabim, and then you'll end up throwing something into Rishus Harabim, and then you'll have hoitzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, against that backdrop, since the beginning of Chelik Gimel, we've documented this many times, and it's going to play a very large role, Mirz Hashem, very soon, when we hit Chelik Dalet. According to the Paiskim that hold that nowadays we don't really have real Rishus Harabims, our streets don't qualify to be bona fide Rishus Harabims, so there's really no potential here for Hoitzah Daraisa. Even if you pick up a rock and throw it at the birds, you're not going to throw it into a real Rishus Harabim. Efshir Deshari B'chol Zeh, then it could be that this is all mutter, because there's no room for Gzeira. The Gzeira L'Gzeirahi. It would be a double Gzeira. In other words, nowadays, what would you be saying? You would be saying, oh, you can't clap to scare away the birds, because if we allow you to clap to scare away the birds, you might pick up a rock and you might throw it at the birds. That's Gzeira number one. What's wrong with throwing the rock at the birds? Well, if there's no Rishus Harabim, the worst thing it could be is Hoitzah D'Rabbanan. We don't want you to throw a rock to a Carmelis, which is an Issur D'Rabbanan, because if we allow you to do Hoitzah on a Carmelis, you might come to do Hoitzah on Rishus Harabim. So that would be a double Gzeira, Gzeira L'Gzeira. We don't make a Gzeira L'Gzeira. So it could be, says the Mishnah Berurah, that nowadays, according to the Paiskim, that we don't have real Rishus Harabims, this would not be Negeah. The Cholshkein, certainly, says the Mishnah Berurah, L'sape kaf al kaf kalachar yad, if you want to scare away the birds by smacking klachar yad, clapping klachar yad, you see I'm using the back of my hand, if you want to do it klachar yad, so you're doing it with a shinoi, says the Mishnah Berurah, everybody would agree that that's mutter. Now, why is that mutter? So first of all, we already learned at the beginning of the Siman, and we're going to see it again in Siman Shin Lamed Tes, that to clap klachar yad is mutter. That's mutter. You're doing it with a shinoi, that is mutter. Now, so as far as hashmas koil, it's mutter to clap klachar yad. But how about the other problem? That if we allow you to clap to scare away the birds, you might throw a rock. Oh, says the Mishnah Berurah, very cute. That's doesn't apply here either. If you're clapping klachar yad. Why? We're not going to be concerned that you might pick up a rock and throw it. Because once we're requiring you to clap klachar yad, we're not afraid that you're going to come to throw a rock. Because why are you clapping klachar yad? Because you realize that it's Shabbos, and you realize that Hilchos Shabbos demands that you clap klachar yad. Oh, so then you're weiter going to realize it's Shabbos and you're not going to throw a rock. So basically, what did we just say over here? The Mechaber said you're not allowed to clap, you're not allowed to bang on your legs, you're not allowed to dance around and stomp in order to make noise to scare away the birds. It's not a problem of Hashmas Koil, it's not Derek Shir V'Simcha. What's the problem? The problem is Gzeira, that you might come to throw a rock to scare away the birds. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but the clap klachar yad is not a problem. There's no problem of hashmas koil. First of all, again, it's not derech shira v'simcha. Second of all, you're clapping klachar yad, which is mutter. There's also no problem that you might come to throw a rock, because the fact that you're clapping klachar yad shows that you know that it's Shabbos. Once you know that it's Shabbos, you're not going to come to throw a rock. Sif hey. Third line down, Kuf Pei Hey Amid Aleph, says the Mechaber. Ein soichakim, very interesting halacha that a lot of people are not aware of. Ein soichakim be'egoizim, you're not allowed to play with nuts. V'loi b'tapuchim, not with apples. V'kayotze behen, or any such like substances that you could roll. Mishum ashvuye gumais, because of the gzeira that you might come to be mashve gumais. What are we talking about here? Rabbi Isai, we're talking about playing marbles. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about taking walnuts, taking nuts, and rolling them on the ground, where you play that, you try to hit the nut that's in the front, or whatever it is, or you try to roll the nut to a particular place, and if you get it over there, it's 5 points, and if you get it over there, it's 10 points. right? So you could do this with nuts, you could do this with apples, anything that could roll. You could do it with marbles. Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do this. Why are you not allowed to do this? Because of Gzeira Mishum HaShvuyei Gumais. When you play this kind of game on dirt, the first thing that you want to do is you want to create a nice smooth area where you could go roll the things that you're rolling, and you could aim them and they're going to go straight. You can't do it on a bouncy, bumpy, uneven piece of ground. So you're going to want to prepare a piece of ground. You're going to come to be mashve gumais. If you do this outside, taladav chayrish. If you do it inside, on an earthen floor inside the house, boine. So you can't play these kind of games on the dirt floor because of this issue. Let's go a little bit further before we go to the Mishnah Berurah. Right away says the Ramah, Haga v'dafka al gabi karka. The Ramah says this is a problem when you're doing it on the ground. Aval al gabi shulchan. But you want to play it on the dining room table, shari, it's mutter. Now, there's no mashve gumais issue. When are we concerned about being mashve gumais? When you're doing it on the ground. We're not concerned if you're doing it on a piece of furniture on a table. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to extend that. And of course, we're going to have the question, how about doing it nowadays on the living room floor? Are you allowed to do it over there? So, says the Mishnah Berurah. You're not allowed to play these kind of games. Where you roll these items, umakin zuezu, and you try to hit one with the other, the way the young girls would play these games. Very interesting that the Chavetz Chaim says young girls. And I think possibly one of the reasons is because young boys shouldn't be doing this, they should be learning Chumash. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah cutting your test ashvuye gumais. Why would you come to be mashve gumais? Sheyachin derech legalgal egois. Because you're going to prepare a patch to be able, where it's nice and smooth, where you could play such a game, and you're very easily going to come to be mashve gumais. Al gabi shulchan, but to play this on the table, the Ramah said, not an issue. Says the Mishnah Berurah, al gabi machatzeles. You could also do it on a mat. Oy beged, or on a garment, oy tavla, or on a board. So, if you put a board down on the ground, you could do it on a board. You put a mat down on the ground, you could do it on a mat. Because now you're not doing it on the ground. You're doing it on top of something that is on the ground. T'gzeira l'gzeirahi. We're not going to make a gzeira. In other words, we're not going to say like this. Remember, the whole problem here is a gzeira, that if we allow you to play this game on the ground, you might come to be mashve gumais. That's a gzeira. Now you want to tell me, maybe you can't do it on the table, maybe you can't do it on a board. Why? Because if we let you do that, you might do it on the ground. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that would be a gzeira l'gzeira. Aval, and this is where it gets a little thorny. Aval, however, says the Mishnah Berurah, al gabe karka, but to do it on the ground, afilu hi mirutzefes, even if it's ground that's covered with paving blocks or with boards, the loy shayach hashvuye gumais, so there's no hashvuye gumais, gam kain aser. That is aser. The karka bekarka michlif, because you will mix up if we allow you to play it on the ground. In other words, you're not allowed to do this on the ground. You're allowed to do it on the dining room table because there's no room for ashvuye gumais. And we're not going to be geyser the dining room table onto the ground because that's gzeira l'gzeira. We're not going to make such a gzeira, right? So again, you can't do it on the ground, gzeira mishum ashvuye gumais. You could do it on the dining room table because there's no ashvuye gumais on the dining room table. But maybe we should be geyser. Maybe we could say, no, you can't do it on the dining room table because then you might come to do it on the ground. And if you do it on the ground, you might be ashvuye gumais. No, that's gzeira l'gzeira. That we don't say. Now, there's another thing, it seems, from the Mishnah Berurah. If you have bare ground and you want to take a board and you want to put a piece of plywood down on the ground, and you want to play on the piece of plywood, it sounds like that's also mutter, because the Mishnah Berurah says, to do it al gabe machzeles, oy beged, oy tavla, to do it on a mat, or on a garment, or on a board, that's mutter. Now, where is the mat? Where is the board? Where is the beged? It's not on the dining room table, that's mutter anyway, you don't need it. So it's on the ground. That's the Kiddush that the Mishnah Berurah is saying. You could do it on the dining room table. You could also do it on a board on the ground, because you're taking a board, you're putting it on the ground, and you're playing on top of the board. But then says the Mishnah Berurah, but to do it on the ground, even if the ground is covered, meaning you have a paved patio, or you have a patio that's covered with patio blocks, you're not allowed to play over there. Why? Because then you're not taking a board and putting it on the ground and playing on the board. No, you're playing on the ground. Happens to be that this area of ground is covered. That is one gzera. You're not allowed to play on the ground because you might come to be mashvegumais. You can't be mashvegumais over here. It's a paved patio. It doesn't matter. You're playing on the ground. Once you're playing on the ground, we see that as being one gzera. Because we're afraid if you're going to play on the ground where it's paved, you might play on the ground where it's not paved. That we're not going to call gzera, because that's uncomfortably close. You're playing on the ground. But to take a half a sheet of plywood, that's not muktzah, if it's not muktzah. To take a half a sheet of plywood, put it down on the ground, and play marbles on top of that it seems is okay. Because now you took something and you put it on the ground and you're playing on top of it. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So, again, by the way, so are you allowed to play marbles on the floor in the living room? Yes, the poskim say you are. Because now you're not playing on the ground. Again, that's not called playing on the ground. Playing in your house on the living room floor, not called playing on the ground. And remember also that the whole gzeira of being mashvegumais inside nowadays, where all of our floors are covered floors, we don't know from earthen floors indoors, that makes the whole gzeira of being mashvegumais indoors a very shvach gzeira. So the poskim say that zichah to play on our covered floors inside the house, that's like playing on the dining room table, and that is fine. I remember when I was a little kid, I do remember playing marbles with my friend on the living room floor, and somebody coming in and saying, "Oh, you're not allowed to play marbles on Shabbos, you're not allowed to play on the floor, because of mashvegumais." Okay, I was a kid, it didn't sound like it made any sense to me. And then I went and I asked the Rav, and the Rav said, 100% mutter, not a problem. Okay, says the Rama weiter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down, middle of the line. You're allowed to play with, literally, in the Ramah, pieces of bones, shekairin chich, that are called chich. Some say that this is talking about chess. So the pieces were made out of ivory, which is bone. So you're allowed to play with chess. Even though when you clack the pieces around on the board, they make noise. So what? It's not a problem of Hashmas Koil. The chess pieces are not a keli that's miyuchad to make noise. And you have no kavanah to make noise. And whatever noise it makes is not their shira v'simcha. So there's no problem here of Hashmas Koil. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Chaf Aleph. Now, the Mishnah Berurah brings up, by the way, some people say this is chess. Other people suggest that this is a game like Kugelach. You know, I don't know if Kugelach nowadays could be Kugelach, needs explanation. 5 cubes, 5 little metal cubes, you throw them down and you throw one up and you pick one up and etc., etc. So some people say it's talking about that kind of game, and the Ramah is saying you're allowed to play this kind of game and there's no concern of Hashmas Koil. But the Mishnah Berurah brings up something interesting here. Nice cut chaf aleph. Again, it's customary kesef to make special silver Shabbos chess pieces or kogelach pieces. Because somehow, otherwise, there's a uvda dechayil aspect. Sitting and playing a game is not appropriate Shabbos activity. That's weekday activity. But if you make beautiful silver Shabbos pieces, it takes away from the issue of uvda dechayil. Okay? We have over here a very stringent opinion, and we came up against this earlier also, and that is the whole question of playing games on Shabbos. So we spoke about what you're allowed to read on Shabbos, what you're not allowed to read on Shabbos, besides just the question of Shtari Hadyotais, but we also had a lengthy Mishnah Berurah, we had a Ramah, a Mechaber, about reading certain things that are inappropriate for reading on Shabbos. One of them was Divrei Chochmah. You want to read about astronomy or this or that, are you allowed to read these things on Shabbos? So we had Shittas that said there's some Tayelis, you're learning something, so since you're learning something, maybe it's okay. That's why he points out over here, the Maral Salsaim, when you play chess and you learn chess strategy, there's no Tayelis. There's no Tayelis to knowing chess strategy. With all apologies to the grandmasters out there, there's no Tayelis. There's no purpose. There's no value in knowing chess strategy. So he says, therefore, what are you doing it on Shabbos for? Didn't call me nischayk or any games. Aser. It's aser. There's no point to it. It's not for Shabbos. V'af b'chol yizar mishum moshav leitzim. K'mon shekasav b'sibit shen zayin sifteh zayin. V'ayin b'berka yosef shev yoyid b'shem kabel gedol shechmir bazeh. We covered this extensively in Siman Shen Zayin, Ayin Sham. We spoke about this whole question of moshav leitzim, of spending time just playing games. And of course, we always come back to everybody has to know where they're holding, especially when it comes to children, even teenagers. What are they going to be doing if they're not playing the games? It could be that they're going to be doing things that are much less appropriate for Shabbos. It could be that they'll be doing things, chas v'chalila, that are much less appropriate, period, whether it's Shabbos or it's Tuesday. So, okay, playing a game is nicht ärgste Sache. It's not the worst thing in the world to sit down and play a game. You need to pass the time. You do it in a makavadik way. People are friends, are together. There's a chaverschaft, and this and that, so they're playing games. Okay. Says the Ramah weiter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, near the end of the line, says the Ramah. When we talk about the ability to play games, no, it's talking about sitting down and having fun and playing a game. But if you're playing a game where you profit, Aser, that is Aser, even if you're playing like a game of odds and evens. What's a game of odds and evens? A game of odds and evens is like the kids play with nuts on Yom Tov. So one kid goes over to the other kid with a closed fist, and he has nuts in his fist, and he asks the other kid, do I have an odd amount of nuts or an even amount of nuts? That's tam and chasar. Tam is complete, is even. Chasar is lacking, meaning odd. And the other kid guesses. If he guesses right, he gets the nuts. Oh, he was marviach. You lost the nuts. He was marviach. He got the nuts. Now, the Ramah says you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to play a game with his profit and loss, or benefit and loss, even afilu, if it's only tam v'chaser. What's the afilu? The afilu is, remember, we're here in Siman Shin Lamed Ches. We started this conversation about playing games from the perspective of the Yisur of Hashmas Koil. Whatever this game of chich is, whether it's chess or kugelach, whatever it is, there's a noise factor. You clank the pieces. That's how we came to this concept. Now the Ramah is pointing out, he's saying, okay, once we're on the concept, once we're under a discussion of playing games, are you allowed to play a game with his gain and loss? Says the Ramah, no. If there's gain and loss, you're not allowed to play a game, even if there's no aspect of Hashmas Koil, like odds and evens. Odds and evens, there's no Hashmas Koil factor here, but there's gain and loss, which makes it Aser. Why is that Aser? Says the Ramah, and that's Aser because it looks like Mekach Memkar. Yeah, it looks like Mekach Memkar. Two people get together. I have 5 nuts, and he has 2 nuts, and he guesses odd, so I have to give him my 5 nuts. He got my 5 nuts. There was a transfer of ownership over here. So it looks like Mekach Memkar is going on over here, and that's why this is a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, grad oy which means odd or even. Grad b'lashon Ashkenaz. Now, this brings up always shilas of playing games where there's kind of fake mekach umemkar going on, like monopoly, right? You're buying and selling properties. There's bills going and changing hands, etc., etc. Most poskim say that that's fine on Shabbos. What do we do with this halacha? Very simple. By this halacha, there really is stuff changing hands. The nuts are changing hands. I had 5 nuts. I lost them. I gave them to him. I go home empty-handed. So there really is a transfer of ownership. In Monopoly, there's no transfer of ownership. In Monopoly, it's all fake, and when the game is over, all the $100 bills go back into the $100 bill slot, all the properties go into the property slots. Nobody's really buying or selling anything. It's all a game. It's all pretend. It's all make-believe. Masha'ikid, by the nuts, it's real. So that really does look like Mekach Umemkar. Monopoly is not real Mekach Umemkar. Moving along. Sif Vav, says the Mechaber. Also, lishoiv mayim begalgal. You're not allowed to draw water with a wheel. What does that mean? Well, back in the day, some wells were very primitive. There was a rope with a bucket. You lowered the bucket down, and then you pulled it back up to get your water. Some wells were very advanced. They had a galgal. They had a machine. They had a pulley and a crank and this and that. Says the Mechaber, also lishoy mayim begalgal. You're not allowed to draw water with a galgal. Why not? Says the Mechaber, we're afraid you might, since you've got such an advanced well over here, and since it's easy to draw water, this is not Jack and Jill going up the hill with a bucket and a rope. This is already automated, you know, so it's easy to draw water. You might fill up water to irrigate your garden. The chorbasai. A chorva literally is a rune. What does this have to do with runes? They used to plant. A rune was a very good place to plant. You know why? Because the tumble-down walls enclose an area, protects it from animals, etc., etc. So you might go irrigate your churva, oila mishra shel pishtan, or you might draw water and pour it into the soaking pool for your flax. So you're not allowed to draw water with a galgal because it's very easy, and because it's very easy, you might be tempted to draw a lot of water and then go do irrigation, which of course is also on Shabbos. Lifik, therefore, says the Mechaber, if you don't have a gina, you don't have a chorva, you don't have a soaking pool for flax, mutter, it's mutter. Continues the Mechaber, there are those that are more makel, and they say, when we say you can't draw water with a galgal, it doesn't mean a simple crank, a simple pulley. You're not allowed to use a galgal godel. A real fancy galgal, a real advanced well, where you could draw a lot of water easily at one time. That's a well where there's a lot of buckets that are attached to a mechanism so that by turning the wheel, you're filling up multiple buckets at one time. But our primitive wells, where we only get one bucket of water, mutter, it's ganzen mutter, because there's no concern here. There's no room to worry that you're going to go draw enough water to do any kind of irrigation. Says the Mishnah Berurah, because it's very easy. The El Yerabba says that the Iker is like the Mokuladika opinion that this would only be usher by the fancy galgal. Moving along to Sif Zayin, 3 lines off the bottom, says the Mechaber. Remember, they had flat roofs and they used the roofs for storage. So, somebody has produce up on the roof. And he sees it's going to rain, and his produce is going to get ruined. So he wants to go up to the roof. He wants to open the trap door that goes from the roof to the house, and he wants to lower the produce from the roof into the house. He wants to do this on Shabbos. Says the Mechaber, no. You're not allowed to lower the produce down through the trapdoor in the roof. But you are allowed to get a tarp and cover the peiros. Even if you have construction bricks arranged on the roof, and they're set aside for binyan, they're set aside for construction, so they're muktzah machmas gufam, still, you would be allowed to cover them so they shouldn't get wet. Not allowed to move them, but you're allowed to cover them. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Also, l'shal shalom, you're not allowed to lower the produce through the trapdoor into the house. What's the problem here? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Tarach shalom l'tzarei Shabbosu, because you're doing inappropriate exertion on Shabbos. Shalom l'tzarei Shabbos. You're doing tircha on Shabbos to save your produce. That's not Shabbos activity. Sorry, off the table. You're not allowed to do it. But you want to go upstairs to the roof and you want to take down the apples that you need for your Suda, for your dessert. You want to take down the Paris that you need for today, for Shabbos, that you're allowed to do because that's tircha for Shabbos. You're allowed to cover the produce. The Marshal is machmer and he says you cannot cover them. Even if you have bricks up there that are set aside for construction, so they're muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, they're arranged and they're set aside on the roof as construction material, so they're muktzah. Still, you're allowed to cover them with a tarp, but I will also you're not allowed to move them. You're not allowed to move them. Even if they're going to get ruined because you have nothing to cover them with, you're not allowed to move them because they're muktzah. But you're allowed to cover them. Now, part of the chiddush that you're allowed to cover them is realize that what you're doing is you're being metaltel a davar mutter. You're taking a tarp that's not muktzah and you're using it for the benefit of something which is muktzah. So you're being metaltel a davar mutter, but you're doing it b'shvil davar aser, for the benefit of a davar aser. But we said that is mutter. Let's see if we can push along here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaber Sivches, end of the second line off the bottom. Mutter liten kli tachas adelef b'Shabbos. If you have a leak in the house on Shabbos, so the roof is leaking, you could take a bucket and you could put a bucket under the leak. V'im nismale, and if the bucket gets full, shoivchai, you could pour it out. Umachzir l'b'kaimai, and then you could put it back. Now, many of you might have a question in your head from stuff that we learned earlier. Take it easy. Says the Mechaber, v'hu, but there's a caveat. When are you allowed to do this? V'hu sheyeh hadelef roy l'rechitza. That's only if the water is relatively clean water. So it's water that is usable on Shabbos. It's clean rainwater. You can use it for rechitza. Maybe it's even potable. Maybe you can even drink it. So if the water is usable water, then the water is not muktzah. If the water is not muktzah, geig is not the hate. Put a bucket there, catch the water. When the bucket is full, pour it out, put the bucket back, no problem. Avalamin ain't a roy. But if the water is not usable on Shabbos, then the water is muktzah. Why is that a problem? Aser, now it's aser, mishum she'en oisin graf shel re'i lechatchila. Remember that halacha of a graf shel re'i, a chamber pot? Even though technically it's muktzah, the excrement, the refuse is all muktzah, right? Muktzah machmas mius, it's muktzah. But a graf shel re'i, if something reprehensible and disgusting is in your living space on Shabbos, you're allowed to be metaltal it. You're allowed to get it away from you. But you're not allowed to create a graf shel re'i lechatchila on Shabbos. So now let's do the math. If there's a leak of dirty water, the bathroom is leaking, the toilet is leaking, you have a leak of dirty water on Shabbos. You want to go catch it in a bucket. Now that water is muktzah, because that water has no use. Once it goes into the bucket, are you allowed to move it? Really, you're not. Really, you should not be allowed to move it. Because the only heter to move it is that it's a graf shel re'i. But you're not allowed to create a graf shel re'i lechatchila on Shabbos. So really, when you take a bucket and you put it there to catch the muktzah water, really what should be going on in your head is, I'm catching that water and I'm not going to be allowed to move it. Why am I not going to be allowed to move it? It's a graf shel re'i, because you're not allowed to make a graf shel re'i lechatchila on Shabbos. So really, when you put the bucket there to catch the water, your thought process should be that I'm not allowed to move the bucket once it catches the water. Now, if that's true, then like the Bir Halacha says, when you put the bucket there and you catch the water, you're being mevatel kli mehechanoi. You're taking a keli, a bucket, that was eminently usable on Shabbos, and you're making it no longer usable because you're affixing it in place because you're not going to be allowed to move it. That's bittul kli mehechanoi, which we learned you're not allowed to do. So again, If the water that's leaking is usable water, there's no muktzah issue. No problem. Catch the water, empty it out, and put the bucket back. But if the water is not usable water, it's muktzah. If the water is muktzah, then when it lands in the keli, you're not going to be allowed to move the keli, even though it's a graf sharei, because they know it's a graf sharei l'chatchila. Oh, in that case, you're being mavata kli mehechanoi. You're, according to some Rishonim, it's like you're building the bucket into place because you're not going to be allowed to move it. According to other Rishonim, it's like you destroyed the bucket because you're not, before the bucket was usable, now the bucket's not usable. But whatever it is, it's bittul kli me'echana, you're not allowed to do it. So that's why the Mechaber says, Hava Malena Roi, also, you're not allowed to do this. And therefore it's bittul kli me'echana. But here's the catch. Let's say you went keneged this halacha, and you did put the bucket there. Guess what? You're going to be allowed to move the bucket and get rid of it. You know why? Because even though ain't oisin graf sharei lechatchila, if you did make a graf sharei, the bottom line is you are allowed to move it. So it's very funny what comes out here, because really you're not being mavata kli mehechanai. Because really, b'diyaved, you're going to be allowed to move the bucket, but that's only a b'diyaved. You weren't allowed to do this. And since you weren't allowed to do it, your mindset should have been that you are being mevatel kli meichanai. Because really the ikar halacha is you're not allowed to do this. So it comes out a very interesting halacha. Let's try to move quickly through the Mishnah Berurah over here, turning back to Kuf Pei Hei Amud Aleph, the bottom line, Ois Katan Chaf Tes. Tachas Hadelef, the Mechaber said you're allowed to put a bucket under a leak. Shadoylef derech hatikra, a leak coming through the ceiling. V'kayotza bazeh. Ois kat lamed, if it's l'rechitza, if the water is usable for washing. De'ein alamatar hayoyvet she muktzah oinoilad, so that there's no muktzah issue. V'yachal l'shtoisa, you could drink it, or l'rchitz to wash with it. V'hu adinim hu roi rak l'shtias behema, even if it's only usable to give to animals, it's still usable. There's no muktzah issue. Ois kat lamed aleph, also mishum she'ein pirish, ein oisin davar she'yimayis. You're not allowed to create something repulsive. Al smach, relying on the halacha she'yim mutter achakach lo yitziyah kegraf sharei. You're not allowed to create something repulsive on the smach. Oh, it'll be a graf sharei and I'll be allowed to move it. And if you put it down with an intent that it's going to stay there, gam ken aser because you're being mavata kli me'echanai. So again, the fact that should have been your mindset. Your mindset should have been, I'm not going to be allowed to rely on graf sharei. That creates bittul kli me'echanai. But if you did it, b'diavad mutter, hainu af kaidu b'shenes mali, even if it's not all the way full, l'mais it's a graf sharei, you could move it. But remember the halacha of graf sharei, which is only, it's not halacha that you could always move something repulsive. You could move something repulsive if it's in your living space. The Mosalav, having a graf sharei, shetir l'tatel lo yitzil ashpa b'nei kvaydai. Imhu Aimid Bamakim Shi Shivasi Kvuasham the Chanal B'Sim Shel Chesef Lamedalit Ayin Sham. Okay, we'll continue next time with Siman Shimon Lametes. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. Discuss of Liman HaTorah. Should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua for us financial Tiluchim to all the need. We should be Zaycha to see the BS called Tzedek. B'Mher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.